There's something hunting us in Utah's wilderness. Official reports use words like unexplained or unusual, but the truth is far more disturbing. Lights that shouldn't exist, a man who vanished into thin air, and a lake believed to hold something that can't exist. This episode will take you through several cases that beg the question, is there something hunting us that's kept hidden by military forces? On the night of June 29th of 1981, a park ranger working at Glen Canyon National Recreation Area received a strange phone call. The gentleman on the phone explained that 2 nights earlier, he had been with a group of 15 people all camping in Cow Canyon, located in the Escalante River arm of Powell Lake. The group had anchored their houseboat about 50 feet from shore, and they'd spent the day swimming and exploring the red rock formations that make this part of Utah so distinctive. As it got dark outside, they sat around the campfire and told stories, but this particular group was a little different than your typical crowd. All 15 of them were members of the LDS Church from Salt Lake City, which meant no alcohol, drugs, and the man who would later make the official report was actually about to tell the group a story about something that had happened to his family in Explorer Canyon, which was literally the next one over from where they were. He never got to tell that story because right as he was about to start, someone pointed up at the canyon wall and said, "What is that?" You're out on the water, the fog rolling in, and suddenly, your line bends under the weight of something huge. The fight begins. When you finally reel it in, it's a boss fish so big your entire clan would celebrate. That's the thrill of Fishing Clash, the ultimate competitive fishing experience, and it's right at your fingertips. Fishing Clash is more than just a game, it's an adventure. You can compete in real-time battles, climb global leaderboards, and dominate clan wars. Or if you're like me, you simply relax in these stunning, lifelike ecosystems, exploring exotic fisheries recreated in breathtaking detail. There are hundreds of species to discover, from rare tropical monsters to icy fjord giants. And don't worry if you're new, it's super easy to pick up. You can jump in for a quick 5-minute fishing session or spend hours leveling up your gear and reeling in rare catches. With over 50 million players worldwide, fresh events, and constant updates, you'll never run out of new challenges. But here's the best part, I've got a special gift code just for you. Download Fishing Clash using my link in the description box or scan the QR code you see on screen. Enter my code Lurks Beneath to claim a $20 reward, including a unique avatar, totally free. So, do you have what it takes to become a fishing legend? Don't wait, tap the link, redeem your code, and I'll see you in the water. It just looked like a light, but this light was moving in a way that didn't make sense. It was coming down the left side, except it wasn't on the canyon wall, it was just midair, floating along, flashing at regular intervals. Every 2 to 4 seconds, flash, 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 and the entire group was silent as they watched this strange object descend. And then, when it got to about their level, maybe 100 feet up, it started to circle deliberately, like it was observing them. The light continued to circle above, and it was bright enough that when it passed between them and the wall, they could see the red rock face lit up as if someone were shining a spotlight on it. And this went on for over an hour. At some point, one of the group members ran to the houseboat and grabbed a spotlight they had on board. When the light made another pass, coming within 30 feet of where they were sitting, he hit it with the beam. In that split second, they saw something that looked creature-like. It had wings, but it was much larger than any bat they'd ever seen. Then the spotlight beam passed, and it was just a flashlight again. The group was terrified. Some of them started praying. As if things weren't strange enough already, a second light appeared, but coming from the opposite end of the canyon. This new light flashed what appeared to be a signal, a specific pattern, but different from the regular flashing. And the first light answered it. It flashed back with its own pattern, like they were communicating. Both lights turned and flew straight down the middle of the canyon until they vanished into the darkness. The group remained there for the rest of the night, nobody sleeping, everybody watching the sky. So when morning finally came, they packed up their campsite and headed back to the marina. They'd planned to stay out for several more days, but nobody wanted to spend another night there. The thing about Cow Canyon is that it's extremely remote. You could only get there by boat, and the canyon walls are hundreds of feet high, so what did these people see? The ranger who took his statement would later file it as case incident number 811310 with the Department of the Interior National Park Service. It was all very official, very matter of fact. 15 witnesses, no alcohol involved, unexplained lights exhibiting apparently intelligent behavior. It would turn out that what happened to this church group wasn't isolated. That summer of 1981, the National Park Service had been receiving multiple reports of what visitors were calling giant fireflies from people camping along the Lake Powell shoreline. The reports were coming in so frequently that rangers at the Carl Hayden Visitor Center near Glen Canyon Dam had started keeping an informal tally. The Park Service had a theory. There's a power plant called the Navajo Generating Station located southeast of Page, Arizona. It features strobe lights on its smokestacks that can be seen for miles. They figured people were seeing those lights and simply getting confused, except that many of these reports, including the one from Cow Canyon, were coming from people camping in locations where the power plant stacks couldn't possibly be seen. The canyon walls blocked any view of them. But the most disturbing report came 2 weeks after the church group's encounter. Another group had rented a houseboat from Bullfrog Marina in Utah, and they'd planned to be on Lake Powell for a full week. Their first night out, they decided to camp in the same Cow Canyon, the same spot where the church group had been. And the next morning, they returned to Bullfrog Marina. They turned in their houseboat, forfeiting the money they'd paid for. When the marina staff asked what was wrong, they just said, "We're all getting the hell out of here," and refused to elaborate. They just wanted to leave. The ranger who took that report didn't even bother to document it. They had no explanation for what people were seeing. To this day, the Park Service has never explained what people saw in the summer of 1981. Similarly, on a cold November morning in 1983, a police officer drove his patrol car down a dirt road in Simpson Springs, Utah, heading out to check on George Pecoric. The road at the time was barely a road at all. It was just 2 tire tracks cutting through the sagebrush and sand and leading deeper in the desert. At the time, the officer knew George. Everyone at the station did, because George was the guy who lived alone in that beat-up trailer way out at the edge of nowhere, right where the desert met the fence line of the Dugway Proving Grounds. And lately, George had been calling the station a lot. The calls had started about a month ago. George would phone in, usually late at night, and he'd sound genuinely scared. He'd tell whoever answered about these objects with bright flashing lights that would fly over his trailer. Sometimes they'd land out in the desert, maybe a quarter mile from his place, but George insisted that after these lights showed up, little men would come around his trailer. When the officer had first heard about these calls, he'd figured George was drinking. I mean, the guy lived alone, and such isolation can take a significant toll on your mental well-being. But George didn't drink, and he wasn't the type to make up things for attention either. According to George, these little men weren't just passing through, they were harassing him. They'd shine lights directly into his trailer windows at all hours of the night. He'd see them peering in at him, watching him. They'd knock on the metal walls of his trailer, sometimes for hours. The knocking would move around the trailer like they were circling it. The strangest detail, though, was what George said about his property, that these little men would steal things from around his place. Tools, mostly, sometimes camping gear. But a few nights later, the stolen items would reappear right where they'd been taken from, undamaged and clean like they'd never been gone at all. The officer pulled up to George's trailer around 10 in the morning and noticed the place looked the same as it always had. An old aluminum trailer that had seen better days sitting on cinder blocks. Out front were a couple of lawn chairs and George's truck parked alongside. When the officer knocked on the door, nobody answered. He knocked again, harder this time, and called out George's name, but nothing. The door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual. Nobody locked their doors out here. So the officer pushed it open and looked inside, and the trailer was empty. He could see that George's coffee mug was sitting there on the counter. His bed was made, and his jacket was there hanging by the door. Thinking he was maybe close by, he walked around the property calling for George and even checked the outhouse. He walked a wide circle around looking for any sign of where George might have gone, but there was no evidence to show he was here. Not even footprints leading away. But George's truck was still there with the keys in the ignition. The officer drove back to town and filed a missing persons report. They organized the search, where deputies, volunteers from the town, and even folks from the nearby ranches all searched for 3 days, but couldn't find a trace of him. George Pekorek had vanished. It would turn out that George's disappearance had caught the attention of someone other than just the local police. About a week later, a military staff car pulled up to the police station in Simpson Springs. Behind it was a dark blue Air Force van, the kind with no windows in the back. The officer who checked on George happened to be on duty that day, and he watched through the window as 2 men in Air Force uniforms got out of the staff car. They came inside and asked to speak with whoever was handling the Pekorek case, and when the officer identified himself, they had questions, very specific questions. Like, where exactly was George's trailer? Had George said anything about what he'd seen? What about the little men? The officer asked them why the Air Force was interested in a missing persons case. One of them looked at him right in the eye and said it was a matter of national security. That's all. They asked if they could examine the trailer, and of course, the officer, complying, drove out there with them and watched as they went through the whole place. And in fact, the Air Force personnel spent about 2 hours at his trailer, taking measurements, photographing everything, and used some detection equipment around the property, sweeping it in careful grid patterns. They bagged a few items from inside the trailer, although the officer couldn't see what they were. Before they left, one of them turned to the officer and said that if George Pekorek ever contacted anyone, they needed to know immediately. He handed the officer a card with just a phone number on it, no name, no department, just a number. They drove away, and that was it. There was never any explanation or follow-up, and the official missing persons case remained open. But everyone understood that something else was afoot, something nobody was going to talk about. Dugway Proving Grounds, that military facility whose fence line ran just a few miles from George's trailer, wasn't a normal military base. It was a testing ground for chemical weapons, biological agents, and classified projects. People generally knew not to ask questions about what went on there, but witnesses had reported seeing lights in the sky sometimes or hearing explosions that didn't make the news. Every once in a while, somebody would mention seeing something strange out in the desert, but George had been different. He had called the police, he made the reports, he put things on record, and then he was gone. To this day, nobody knows what happened to Mr. Pekorek. The police file remains open, technically, although nobody expects it to be solved. It's easy to speculate that the military intervened. On January 5th of 2019, strange and mysterious booms were heard and felt across northern Salt Lake City. According to the University of Utah seismograph station, there had been no seismic activity at the time. Neither was there avalanche control work happening on any of the surrounding ski resorts. Could it be that the military is conducting tests deep underground? Perhaps George Pekorek was starting to uncover some of the truth. On the afternoon of October 6th, 2020, Kaylee Chambers stood in the grotto parking area at Zion National Park, watching her mom climb into the private shuttle van. Her mother, Holly, had a huge smile on her face as she adjusted her blue backpack and pulled her hair into a ponytail and waved goodbye and climbed in. But for some reason, Kaylee had this feeling in the pit of her gut that something wasn't right. Just moments before this, Holly gave her daughter a quick hug and told her she'd be taking the Kayenta Trail toward the Emerald Pools. The shuttle that dropped Holly off was scheduled to swing back around at 4:40 to pick her up, which gave her about 3 or so hours to explore. As Kaylee walked back to her car, she turned and waved one more time at her mom, who was now fully in the shuttle. Kaylee became anxious for some reason. By 5:30 that evening, Kaylee was sitting in her car back at the grotto parking area, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel and checking her phone every few seconds. The shuttle had come and gone at 4:40, and she'd watched every single person get off, but her mom wasn't one of them. She figured her mom had just lost track of time or maybe decided to catch a later shuttle, which would have been annoying but not exactly out of character. But now, as it was getting later and later, her anxiety was worsening. She'd already called her mom's phone 6 times, but it kept going straight to voicemail, which probably meant her phone was dead or she was somewhere with no signal. Kaylee got out of her car, walked over to where a couple of rangers were talking near the visitor center, trying to keep casual, as she asked if maybe someone had seen a woman, about 5'3", brown hair, blue backpack, who might have missed the shuttle. They just told her they'd keep an eye out, but Kaylee could tell from their expression they didn't really consider this a big deal. 2 days later, on October 8th, Kaylee was basically falling apart. She'd spent the entire previous day driving around to every trailhead and parking area, anywhere her mom might have ended up, and she'd found her mom's van sitting right where it should be, at the park's southwest entrance in Springdale. But there was no sign of Holly. Kaylee's crippling anxiety was now full-blown panic. Over the next 10 days, Zion National Park turned into a full-fledged search operation. There were search and rescue teams from 3 different counties, 5 different canine units with their handlers, and even a specialized drone team that had come up from the Grand Canyon, all working towards one common goal: to find Holly. Park rangers reviewed security footage from October 6th and used this video still of her to help locate her. Of course, there was no footage of her exiting the park. Every morning, she watched from the visitor center as teams headed out on their search. The dogs would disappear into the canyon with their noses to the ground, and the drone would buzz overhead, scanning every cliff face and hidden ravine. They were searching in temperatures that swung wildly, from cold at night to blazing hot during the day. The search teams kept telling Kaylee that people could survive for weeks without food, but water was the real issue. Fortunately, the Virgin River ran through the park, so maybe, just maybe, Holly had found water. But as each day passed with no sign of her mom, she could see it in the searchers' faces when they came back each evening, that look that said they were starting to shift from a rescue op to something else. Meanwhile, somewhere in the thick vegetation along the Virgin River, Holly was losing track of everything. She couldn't remember if she'd been out here for 3 days or 13 days. The marks she'd been making on the tree trunk with her Sharpie had started to blur together in her mind. Her head throbbed constantly, and sometimes when she touched the back of her skull, she could feel this massive lump that made her dizzy just thinking about it. She'd set up her hammock between 2 trees in what seemed like a good spot at first, hidden in all the thick brush, but now she couldn't remember why she'd chosen this place or even how she'd gotten here. She was extremely thirsty, and with the Virgin River being like 50 feet away, she could hear it constantly, even though she couldn't drink from it. She had lost so much weight that her hiking pants kept sliding down her hips. Every time she would try to adjust them, her head would spin and she'd have to grab onto the tree to keep from falling. The worst was at night, when she could sometimes see the beams of flashlights in the distance, but she was too weak and fatigued to call out for help. On the morning of October 18th, she was lying in her hammock, staring up through the trees at the sky, her grip on reality slipping even further. It had now been 12 days, and suddenly, she heard voices. But unlike what she'd heard before, these sounds were really close. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. And then suddenly, there was this little face peering through the bushes at her. Because she was delirious from dehydration, she couldn't figure out who or what it was. And as her eyes adjusted, she could see that it was a boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The boy was just as shocked as she was, and he turned around and yelled something Holly couldn't make out. The little boy started pointing at her, and then Holly could hear more voices getting louder and coming closer. People now were crashing through the brush toward her, and someone was saying, "Oh my God, we found her, she's alive, she's here." Holly wanted to cry, but she didn't have enough moisture left in her body. Within minutes, the area around her hammock was swarming with search and rescue, and Kaylee was running through the brush, practically knocking people over to get to her mom. When she finally saw Holly, she almost didn't recognize her. Her mom had lost at least 15 pounds, her face was gaunt, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and there was dirt caked under her fingernails and in her hair. The medics were checking Holly's vitals, shining lights in her eyes, and asking her questions she could barely answer with nods and head shakes. They kept saying her kidneys were struggling, her potassium was low, and they needed to get her out of there. But something strange had happened. When they tried to put Holly on a stretcher, she pushed it away and insisted on walking out herself. They were clearly surprised that someone who'd been missing for 12 days in this environment could even stand, let alone walk. But Holly, with Kaylee supporting her on one side and a ranger on the other, slowly made her way through the vegetation, and as they emerged onto the trail, one of the search and rescue guys pulled out his GPS and muttered something. They were only half a mile from the grotto parking area, the exact spot where Holly had been dropped off 12 days ago. However, when investigators examined her story more closely, things didn't quite add up. Sergeant Daryl Cashin from Washington County Sheriff's Search and Rescue pointed out several inconsistencies. No ambulance was ever called when they found her, despite her supposed critical condition. She just walked out and went with her family. The search teams had covered that exact area multiple times with dogs and drones and somehow missed a bright blue hammock half a mile from the parking lot. They also couldn't understand how Holly, who was supposedly so disoriented from a head injury that she couldn't call for help and had the presence of mind to mark 12 precise days on a tree with a Sharpie that she just happened to have. Perhaps most puzzling is her phone, which, when they checked it, had battery life, but she never once tried to call 911 or used the flashlight function to signal searchers at night, and never even turned it on. When asked about what exactly happened during those 12 days, her answers became vague, and her family quickly stepped in to say she needed time to recover before answering questions. What do you guys think? Because it's certainly odd. Some of the most unusual accounts of phenomena in the Utah wilderness date back over 100 years. In the summer of 1871, J.H. McNeil was working the salt flats near Monument Point on the northern shore of Great Salt Lake. He worked for Barnes & Company, harvesting salt from the ancient lake bed. It was brutal work under the Utah sun. However, McNeil had been doing it for years, and he knew every sound the lake made. That's why when he heard the bellowing, he froze. It wasn't a sound that belonged, it was a deep guttural, like a bull, but wrong somehow. He turned toward the water and saw something that shouldn't exist. Rising from the lake was a massive head. McNeil would later describe it as alligator-like, but with features of a horse. Water streamed off its dark hide as it fixed its eyes on him and the other workers. Then it started moving toward them. The men ran, they scrambled up to the nearest hill as the bellowing grew louder behind them, and they didn't stop until they reached a rocky outcropping where they could hide. They stayed there until nightfall, where they listened to sounds from below, splashing, scraping, bellowing. And when dawn finally came, they crept back down to where they'd been working, and the ground was torn up. There were boulders that had sat undisturbed for decades were now overturned, and in the mud were tracks, massive tracks leading from the water's edge up to the beach and then back in the lake. But McNeil and his co-workers weren't the first to see something in the Great Salt Lake, and they wouldn't be the last. The lake is the largest saltwater lake in the Western Hemisphere. The water is so salty, up to 8 times saltier than the ocean, that people assume nothing can live in it. They're wrong. For as long as people have lived near here, they've reported seeing things that shouldn't be there. The native tribes who lived along its shores for many, many years told the first European explorers about a creature with a huge head that lived in the waters. It would snatch birds from the air, and sometimes horses and cattle that wandered too close to the water would vanish. Their warning was simple: stay away from the deep water. They also spoke of other beings in the lake. They called them water babies, creatures the size of humans with long black hair and fishtails. Fishermen would later report hearing sounds like crying babies coming from the water at night. When they'd investigate, they'd see dark shapes beneath the surface. In the 1840s, Brother Bainbridge, one of the Mormon settlers near Antelope Island, reported seeing something he described as dolphin-like swimming in the lake. He watched it for several moments before it dove and didn't resurface. When he told others what he had seen, they said it was impossible, that the lake was too salty for dolphins to live in. Besides, how would a dolphin get to a landlocked lake in the middle of Utah? Obviously, he didn't have an answer, but neither did the ranchers whose cattle kept vanishing. By the 1870s, the stories had become increasingly difficult to ignore. There were multiple witnesses who were reporting creatures in the lake, and the descriptions all varied. Some said alligator-like, others said more like a serpent. The sizes ranged wildly too. 5 feet, 15 feet, some claimed 75 feet, but they all agreed on one thing, that something large was living in Great Salt Lake. Of course, scientists dismissed all of it, that the lake was too salty, the sightings were simply misidentified birds, and the crying sounds of water babies were just gulls. But around this same time, a story began circulating. A story so strange that most assumed it had been a legend. But if it were true, it would explain everything. In 1873, a man named James Wickham decided to become a whale farmer. Now, let that sink in for a moment, no pun intended. In the 1870s, in landlocked Utah, a man supposedly decided to farm whales in a salt lake in the desert. According to the tale, Wickham wasn't insane, he was a businessman who saw an opportunity. Whale oil was incredibly valuable in the 1870s. It lit lamps, lubricated machinery, and was used in everything from soap to margarine. Wickham allegedly had this idea: why risk his life whale hunting in the open ocean when you could raise them in a controlled environment? The Great Salt Lake seemed perfect. It was salty like the ocean, and it was huge, plenty of room for whales to grow, and no international waters, no competition from other whalers. And so the story goes that he spent a year in Australia capturing whales, and he supposedly had a ship specially built to hold enough seawater to haul the whales back. Wickham had allegedly planned every detail. He managed to bring 2 whales to the Great Salt Lake, both of which were from Australian waters, both about 35 feet long. He kept them in a pen at the mouth of the Bear River where fresh water mixed with salt water, and then they escaped. Apparently, 6 months later, 2 whales were spotted in the lake, except now they were 60 feet long, which is nearly twice their original size, and they weren't alone. Swimming with them were smaller creatures ranging from 3 to 15 feet in length. If you believe the story, the whales hadn't just survived, they had thrived and they'd bred. Now here's where things get really interesting. Linda Dunning, who wrote about Utah's mysteries and legends, documented this, but even she acknowledged it was more the result of slow news days rather than fact, probably. Whether James Wickham ever actually introduced whales to the Great Salt Lake remains unknown. I'm no marine biologist, but the water chemistry is probably not right and the food supply is inefficient. And it does seem like a story that's cooked up by a newspaper desperate for readers. However, how do we explain what people keep seeing? How do we explain McNeil's encounter in 1871, 2 years before Wickham allegedly brought his whales? The creature that chased him and his co-workers up that hill that left tracks in the mud, what was it? Now, the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources officially states that no large animals live in the Great Salt Lake. It's all misidentification and hoaxes, case closed. But the native tribes knew something was in that lake long before any of us did. Remember that these were people who weren't looking for attention. They weren't trying to sell newspapers. They were just people who saw something they couldn't explain in a lake everyone says is too dead to support life. The Great Salt Lake reaches depths of 33 feet in some areas, and much of it has never been properly surveyed. But does it make sense? A lake of that size with a history of sightings going back centuries with native legends, and we just dismiss it all? Strangely, the sightings have continued into modern times. Fishermen still report strange encounters, boaters still see things they can't explain, and every few years, someone claims to spot something huge surfacing in the lake before disappearing again. Things that crawl and squirm around lakes aren't the only things hunting us in Utah's wilderness. On September 15th, 1976, Michael Routh and his friend Kenny headed into the mountains above Brigham City, Utah. It was a perfect morning for hiking, and they'd been walking for hours at this point, working their way up through the valleys when they reached the top of a ridge. There was an old shepherd's cabin up there with a small pond in front of it. The water in the pond was crystal clear, possibly fed by a natural spring, which made it suitable for drinking. Kenny was thirsty from the climb, so he knelt, cupped his hands, and took a long drink. That's when Michael noticed something odd. The dirt around the pond was smooth and undisturbed. The only tracks in the mud were the ones Kenny had just made. It was strange that you would have such a great water source with no animal tracks near the water's edge, and Michael looked around. The whole area was wrong somehow. It was silent. In the middle of a forest in broad daylight, there wasn't a single sound except their own breathing. They hung around for about 15 minutes, but the silence was really getting to them. Finally, they said, you know what, we should get out of here, and they decided to head back down. They were about halfway down the ridge when Kenny heard something. Grouse calling from the trees on the opposite slope. Kenny was a hunter, and he couldn't resist. Michael had a shotgun in his pack, one of those break-action single-shot models. He assembled it and handed it to Kenny along with shells. Kenny headed down into the draw between the two ridges while Michael waited on the spine, watching. Now, Kenny struggled to get position because the thorn bushes were 7 to 8 feet high, so thick you couldn't see through them. But Kenny pushed in anyway, determined to get to those birds. He was fighting through the thorns when it happened. A branch snagged his arm badly, tore right through his shirt, but Kenny yanked forward trying to free himself, but that just made it worse. More branches grabbed him. He was stuck. Suddenly, both men heard a loud crash from somewhere up the mountain, way above where Kenny was trapped. Then, 3 sounds in rapid succession. Thunk, 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 heavy and fast. So Michael looked up the slope, and about 400 yards above Kenny's position, something was moving down the mountain and it was heading straight for Kenny. Michael started screaming, "Kenny, get out now!" And Kenny heard Michael's yelling, and he heard whatever was coming down the mountain. The crashing was getting louder and closer. Kenny ripped himself out of those thorns. Didn't matter that they were shredding him. He just ran. Blood was running down his arms. The thorns had torn his clothes. Halfway through the thorn patch, though, Kenny's finger slipped. The shotgun went off, one barrel straight into the air. Bam! The charging stopped. Whatever had been coming for Kenny turned and ran the opposite direction back up the mountain. The crashing sounds faded into the distance. Kenny made it back to Michael, bleeding, shaking, still clutching the shotgun, and they didn't talk. They just moved as fast as they could, all the way back the way they came. They needed to get off that mountain. Michael couldn't explain it, but both of them were in full fight or flight mode. These men are experienced outdoorsmen and were incredibly frightened by what happened. It would be almost 2 weeks before Kenny could even talk about it, and when he finally did, Michael told them what he'd seen charging down the slope. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a mountain lion, and it wasn't any animal that was supposed to be in those Utah mountains. The thing Michael saw was 7 to 8 feet tall, running on 2 legs, covered in dark reddish-brown hair with something white on top, maybe around its head or shoulders. Michael had gotten a pretty good look at it. The afternoon sun was bright and visibility was perfect. He knew what he saw. Whatever lived up in those mountains around that abandoned cabin was most likely using that pond as its water source, and because water sources attract a wide range of animals, they provide a relatively abundant food source. Of course, Michael isn't alone, as there have been sightings of similar things all throughout Utah. The most famous in recent years is the Provo Canyon footage, which I've covered before in a previous video. Do you believe that there are truths to all these witness accounts of the strange and supernatural? Do you believe that there is active suppression of information about something hunting us in Utah? For now, folks, all of it remains a mystery. And because you guys made it this far, I want you to all comment down below salty whales. So that way, I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy this kind of content where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode. Thank you to Fishing Clash for sponsoring this video. Download Fishing Clash now with my code Lurks Beneath.